attack, and the Russians are repelling tank attacks using RPGs. The camera on a Ukrainian tank captured the moment when an anti-tank grenade flew past the tank. A minute later, another grenade struck the tank. Here are two Russian tanks that ventured out for a counterattack. But the Ukrainians destroyed one of the tanks with a precise hit from an anti-tank missile. Shortly after, another tank was destroyed. The crew couldn't control the tank and send it into a ditch. Later, the tank exploded and turned it into scrap metal. Another Russian tank approached close to the Ukrainian positions and was spotted by reconnaissance. With the help of a kamikaze drone, the tank was successfully ignited. The Russians tried to extinguish it, but failed. They abandoned the tank and fled while the tank burned down completely. However, to be objective, it must be acknowledged that the Russians also managed to inflict painful losses on the Ukrainian forces. For example, the Russians found and destroyed a Ukrainian 2S-1 artillery system along with its ammunition. As the Ukrainians advance, they attack Russian positions with the support of tanks. However, during the offensive, the Ukrainians have to clear mines from roads and fields to allow their armored vehicles to pass through. The Russians have created heavily mined areas, and the Ukrainians have to spend a lot of time and effort to breach the minefields to understand the extent to which the Russians have mined Ukrainian fields and roads. Take a look at this video. A Ukrainian armored transporter was returning to the rear, but even there, it encountered a mine and detonated. And even the Russians sometimes fall to their own mines. For example, a Russian tank was returning to its positions and detonated on its own mine. Ukrainian sapper teams are working in the liberated territories. This is also a very complex job. The discovered Russian mines are collected and then destroyed by detonating them together. Ukrainian generals, led by Mr. Zelensky, have focused on destroying Russian logistics. They are destroying bridges and ammunition depots belonging to the Russians. Recently, Ukrainian aviation targeted and destroyed a bridge that served as the route for 70% of ammunition supplies to Russian forces. In this video, two Ukrainian armored transporters are moving along the road. The first one passed through a mined area and harmed, while the second one detonated on a mine to clear the passages. Ukrainian forces use specialized demining vehicles. The process itself looks very impressive, but takes a lot of time. Sometimes demining operations are conducted during offensive operations. It is a complex task that requires a high level of coordination among all units. Here's another instance where a Russian modern tank, the T-90, was detected by Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance. It was targeted with an X-caliber projectile and destroyed. Additionally, the X-caliber projectile destroys numerous Russian artillery systems like the TOS-19 and Grad BM-1, as well as multiple ammunition depots hidden by the Russians and abandoned houses and gardens. The Russian tank attempted to hide from the Ukrainian artillery behind the trees, but the Ukrainian reconnaissance spotted its location. A precision strike with an X-caliber guided projectile was launched against the tank. The result is the destruction of a Western-made Ukrainian armored vehicle and logistics vehicles as well. However, in response, the Ukrainians launch massive attacks using drones, destroying even more Russian armored vehicles. I can make a video several hours long showing the extensive losses of Russian military equipment from the strikes of Ukrainian army drones. The Russians know how dangerous these small Ukrainian drones are and fear them so much. As soon as they spot a Ukrainian drone nearby, they immediately abandon their armored vehicles and flee. The Ukrainian forces have also perfected their aerial reconnaissance on the battlefield. It involves a drone capable of dropping grenades. This weapon should not be underestimated. The drone can locate an ammunition depot and destroy it with just a single grenade. Moreover, the drones are capable of destroying a vast number of armored Russian vehicles. Perhaps no other weapon has destroyed as much armored machinery as the bomber drones. Nothing can compare to this weapon on the front lines of combat. The Russians do not know how to combat drones. They have no solution to this problem. Watch how the projectiles explode and scatter in different directions. The X-caliber is a highly advanced 155mm caliber projectile equipped with GPS guidance and can be fired from almost any NATO standard 155mm howitzer. It is evident that in preparation for the offensive, the Ukrainian army has stockpiled a sufficient number of such projectiles to destroy hundreds or even thousands of units of Russian equipment. Economically, this is also a favorable exchange. The cost of a single projectile is approximately $100,000, whereas it can destroy a tank worth $3 million or other significant Russian equipment. The Ukrainian army continues its offensive. Ukrainians are exerting immense pressure on the Russian defense line through concentrated artillery fire from all types of guns, ranging from the smallest to the largest. Take a look at how skillfully and accurately the Ukrainian forces are using precision-guided munitions like the Excalibur. Today, I'll show you the best moments of the combat actions. In this video, you can see a Russian self-propelled howitzer 2S9 taking position in a forested area. The Ukrainian forces noticed it and delivered a precise strike with just a single projectile. It resulted in a massive explosion since the ammunition detonated along with the howitzer. For instance, in this video, you can see how Russian drone, the Lancet, hit a German Leopard tank and ignited it from the inside. However, the tank's turret wasn't blown off because all its ammunition was stored in a separate compartment. If a Russian tank catches fire with ammunition inside, it will most likely explode. We have witnessed numerous cases where Russian tanks have their turrets blown off. On another front segment, the Russians attacked Ukrainian positions with the assistance of 3 tanks. However, under the pressure of Ukrainian artillery, all 3 tanks were damaged. One of the tanks had its turret blown off. As is typical with Russian tanks, by the way, this is a significant difference between German tanks and Russian tanks. The video clearly shows a minefield nearby. It appears that the tank accidentally drove over one of the mines. The Russians abandoned that tank. Here's another Russian tank that detonated on its own mine. The Russians abandoned the tank and fled the battlefield. The Ukrainian soldiers destroyed the tank using a kamikaze drone. And sometimes mines behave very deceitfully and unpredictably. Interestingly, the Russians do not possess such highly accurate artillery capabilities. As a result, in order to hit its target, the Russians have to use hundreds of projectiles and old 40-year-old howitzers to resort to multiple rocket launch systems. Consequently, the Russians will sooner or later experience a severe shortage of ammunition in their attempts to halt the Ukrainian offensive. The Russians are conducting clumsy counterattacks, but they are losing even more armored vehicles. Ukrainian army also suffered significant losses from Russian kamikaze drones like the Lancet. Here's an instance where such a drone destroys a Ukrainian S-300 air defense complex. Here's another such case. These are very painful losses for the Ukrainians. And here the Lancet destroys Ukrainian armored vehicles. The Lancet is also capable of destroying Ukrainian tanks. In this video, we can see how the Russians tracked a Ukrainian Grad multiple rocket launcher system and destroyed it using the same Lancet drone. Here, additionally, Ukrainians systematically destroy Russian fuel reserves and ammunition depots. Several large ammunition storage facilities have been destroyed in the past weeks. Sooner or later, this will have an impact on the Russian strategic defense, and it will be breached no matter how much military equipment and personnel you have. The Ukrainian army has made surprising advances in the struggle for freedom, especially in this critical time period. So what stage did these surprise advances take the water now? Let's find out. Together with latest Ukraine frontlines updates with stunning details. First of all, let's look briefly at the Western support for Ukraine's preparation for the Crimean offensive and what kind of clashes are taking place in and around Crimea on the southern front. And how does Ukraine disable the Russian S-300 air defense systems, the pillar of Russian air dominance? While the Eastern European bloc is determined as dangerous borders due to the war in Ukraine, the approach of the Baltic countries caused the water in the Black Sea to boil for the Russians. The steps taken by the Baltic Trio in this regard are of vital importance in order to trap the Russian Navy's ships in the Baltic. Other Baltic countries continue to support the Ukrainian army, both militarily and financially. With these supports and the great efforts of the Ukrainian Navy and Air Force, it is making critical moves in the southern front lines in and around the Crimea, in the Kherson and Island region, especially here. The Ukrainian Air Force's destruction of the Russian S-300 air defense systems and neutralization of the air dominance of the Russian troops helps the Ukrainians to prepare the ground for a strong ground attack. Over the past weeks, the Crimean Peninsula has come under attack by the drone army of Ukrainian forces. Dozens of airstrikes have increased Ukrainian threats to Crimea. On the other hand, the Ukrainian armed forces conducted serious offensives in Kherson, Dnipro, and Kinbernspit this week. In other words, the intensity of the clashes on the southern front lines turned into a southwester with the warm breeze of the spring season. So why can't the Russian army stop the Ukrainians from focusing on Kherson, Dnipro, and the Crimea? And the Russians are beginning to give up on the southern front lines. Our Russian air defense systems no longer able to protect Crimea and its surroundings. The successful offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces in the Crimea, Kherson, and Dnipro regions have brought to the fore some important shortcomings in the Russian army, especially in the Crimean Peninsula. The attacks carried out by the Ukrainians was one of the issues that fueled the discussion of this deficiency in the Russian army after the Crimea. The concentration of the Ukrainian forces in the Kherson and Dnipro Islands region this week caused the tension to flare up again on the agenda this week. In just 24 hours, the Ukrainian defense forces on the country's southern front lines completed 170 firing missions, eliminating 15 invaders and destroying a Grad multiple rocket launch system on Kinbern Island. In addition, a Russian ammunition depot in the Novokakhovka area, 2 reconnaissance UAVs, 2 motorboats intended for use by Russian destroyer groups and artillery radar system, a 120mm mortar, and several military trucks belonging to the Russian army were destroyed. The southern Ukrainian operation, which began with these striking offensive actions, continued with the same intensity on the same day. On the left bank of the Dnipro River, Ukrainian forces also destroyed an S-300 air defense system of the Russian army. This attack of Ukraine dealt a very hard blow to the Russians in this period of time, when rumors about the S-300 defense system's inability to fully fulfill its function. The Ukrainians' deactivation of this missile system in Dnipro created an earthquake in Moscow last week. The Russians had already started selling their S-300 back to their manufacturers due to constant malfunctioning. Now such an attack in Dnipro has resurfaced. This critical problem in the field of air defense. On the other hand, Russian S-300s are also in the Crimea. It was claimed that the most important reason for the unmanned aerial vehicle attacks carried out by the Ukrainian forces over the past week was the inability of the S-300 to be sufficiently functional. In fact, the Russians had mostly moved to Ukraine's southern front lines to the Crimean Peninsula. However, the refocusing of the Ukrainians on the peninsula proved the inadequacy of the air defense systems there. In addition, the loss of a total of 13 Seaman 300 air defense systems during the war before the spring period completely changed the situation on the southern fronts of Ukraine. These air defense system losses of the Russians occurred mainly in the Kherson region. In addition, the Russian troops who lost their S-300 in Crimea became more and more desperate for air defense over time. In the Kherson region, especially after the new year, to date, 6 S-300s have been lost. This upset the plans of the Russian troops to recapture the Kherson region because the Russians could not respond to the airstrikes of the Ukrainian forces here and also could not carry out any offensives in the Zaporizhia region. The loss of 5 S-300s in total in a short period of time had begun to annoy Moscow in a period of about 4 months. The loss of 12 Seaman 300 by the Russians caused the Ukrainian forces to focus much more on the southern front lines. Finally, with the neutralization of an S-300, the total number of losses increased to 13. The fact that the Russian army lost 13 Seaman 300, mainly on the southern front, was enough to bring the tension in the south of Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula to a peak. Ukrainian forces intensified their attacks on the peninsula, taking advantage of this tension and the weakness of the Russians in air defense. As we mentioned during the past week, the recent clashes in Dnipro and Kherson following the Ukrainian attacks on Crimea continued to trigger the major offensive against Crimea. Even these days, while the attacks of the Ukrainians on the peninsula are stirring the agenda, new war strategies followed by Kiev are slowly starting to emerge. In fact, The road to victory for Ukraine was through the Crimea. Kiev was aware of the situation. The fact that the peninsula was the target of the Ukrainian army seriously worried the residents of the Crimea region. In addition, these attacks in the Dnipro region and the military preparations of the Ukrainian forces in Kherson were considered as the signs of the great attack that was claimed to be organized on the peninsula. However, what most intensified the tensions in the peninsula was that the Russian S-300s lost their function and could no longer protect Crimea. Russia, which was looking for allies in military support, continued to do that in order to protect both the peninsula and the regions they had captured on Ukrainian territory. But Russia's isolation policies have isolated them in this regard. In other words, the chances of the Russians getting help with air defense systems or developing their own defense industries are very low because the war in Ukraine has put Russia into an economic collapse. For this reason, Russian leader Vladimir Putin played all the cards in his hand. Ukraine, on the other hand, continued to receive support in the world arena for its wars with the Russians the other day. US President Joe Biden contacted French President Emmanuel Macron to talk about aid to Ukraine in a written statement shared by the White House. It was reported that Biden had a telephone conversation with the French president. The statement discussed the leaders' determination to continue providing support and security assistance to Ukraine, as well as their commitment to make Russia pay a price for its aggression. As a result of these talks, it was started to be discussed that the regular continuation of the support sent to the Ukrainian army would cause the Russians to experience much bigger problems than the S-300 losses at such a critical breaking point of the war. Of course, the perseverance of the Ukrainians is very important. But Western aid is also one of the biggest factors in this war of attrition, which caused the Ukrainians to show much more resistance than the Russians. For this reason, we think that the predictions that the Russians will face much bigger problems in continuing this war in the coming days are not wrong at all. We will be able to see this situation much more clearly on the front lines in Ukraine in the coming days. There are a lot of updates from the east. Russian forces tried to capitalize on the recent gains in front of the main supply route to Bakhmut, conducted an extensive assault on the Romanian trenches, and managed to push Ukrainians from the road. However, Ukrainians cut Russian supplies with fire, let Russians stay under constant drone and artillery strikes, and launched an unblocking operation clearing half of the field. Last time I told you that Russians managed to breach one of the lines of fortifications in front of the home of a highway and cut off a huge portion of supplies. I also told you that the situation remained unstable because Ukrainian held trenches surrounded Russian positions. And since there are around 50 meters apart, the clashes here continued. The freshest reports indicate that Russians got trapped. Holding this trench under constant fire was extremely difficult, which is why Russians made several attempts to retreat. Unfortunately for Russians, even retreating from this trench would be problematic because at the moment they got out of trench to cross the tree line, they would have been shot. Such a situation, however, worked in favor of the Russian command, who preferred not to lose it, as taking each line comes at a great cost. That is why the Russian command quickly prepared another wave of attack and stormed the outer two lines once again. Russian attack was very successful and they managed to push Ukrainians all the way to the trenches south of the road. But intense clashes did not end here. Ukrainians immediately started preparing for a counterattack and in the meantime assigned the most skilled drone operators to drop grenades on Russians in the trenches non-stop. The fighters from the 92nd Mechanized Brigade reported that only their drone operators managed to eliminate more than 40 Russian troops here over the last 2 days. After undermining Russian defense capabilities, Ukrainians conducted a short, mechanized assault to pave the way for their infantry. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians used several tanks and armored vehicles, although they used the equipment carefully and provided fire support at distance. Combat footage revealed that while Russian positions in the eastern trench were under fire, special operators from the National Guard of Ukraine crossed the road and engaged in close combat fighting. This was the first major step in recapturing the trench network. The latest footage features fighters from the famous 3rd Assault Brigade. Judging by the footage, they successfully breached Russian defense and completely cleared the closest to the road line. A fighter from the 8er Battalion reported that Russians do not hold positions closer than 200 meters from the road, which means that Ukrainians establish total control over the trenches between the highway and the field road. From here, Ukrainians will likely attack the western line first because it is the most vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. For now, the Crimea highway still remains inoperable because the Russians are too close. The road is in their line of sight, which means that they can conduct direct fire at vehicles once they are pushed behind the tree line. Russians will only be able to rely on indirect fire, which means surveilling the area with drones and coordinating with artillery and mortar crews. Conducting indirect fire is extremely difficult as drones can be shot down or run out of battery and artillery needs to react timely. The road is only 5 kilometers long, which means that Russians have only 3 minutes to react if the average speed is 100 kilometers per hour. Nonetheless, at this time, Ukrainians are receiving supplies via the Ivanovsky Highway, and today's footage shows how Ukrainians successfully entered the city. When it comes to the city itself, Ukrainian fighters reported that most of the fights continue to take place along Crimea Street. A fighter from the 24th Assault Brigade reported that Russian snipers assumed positions in the high-rise buildings on Levanevsky Street. Later, Ukrainians rolled out their tanks and decimated Russian positions in these buildings, which allowed Ukrainians to move in the region more freely. When it comes to the center, recent geolocated footage suggests that Russians managed to take the first street west of the rails. The footage shows how Russians are firing at Ukrainian positions in the high-rise building. The fighting along the central and southern line remains intense, although this axis is still secondary for Russians as their main efforts are directed towards the outer edge of the city. Overall, the battle for Bakhmut continues to buy Ukrainians time to receive the pledged tanks and equipment for the main phase of the counter-offensive operation. Because many countries organized the deliveries just this week and many still plan to do it next week. The head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said that Ukrainians need at least 10 days of relatively hot and dry weather for the ground to become suitable for broad mechanized assaults by holding Bakhmut. Ukrainians are forcing Russians to deploy at least 3 times as many troops just to maintain progress inside the city. But more importantly, Ukrainians do not allow Russians to redeploy from Bakhmut. Tens of thousands of troops because as long as the Ukrainians are inside the city, Russians are afraid of the unblocking operation and continue to reinforce Bakhmut's flanks at the expense of other directions.